Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Brainstorming Friend or Foe, Turn Chaos into Creativity, featuring Art Markman and Tracy Wooster. My name is Amanda Golden, and I will be your moderator today. We're thrilled to have you with us for the next 60 minutes, with about 10 minutes reserved for questions at the end. So again, feel free to put those in the chat box, and we have time to revisit those. I am pleased today to introduce Dr. Art Markman and Dr. Tracy Wooster, who are both deeply involved with our Human Dimensions of Organizations programs here at UT Austin. A little more about our speakers today. Art Markman is the Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs and the Annabelle Arion Centennial Professor of Psychology and Marketing at the University of Texas at Austin. He was also the founding director of the HDO program. He received his PhD in 1992 from the University of Illinois and worked at Northwestern University and Columbia University before coming to the University of Texas at Austin in 1998. Dr. Markman has published more than 150 scholarly works about cognitive science, decision-making, and organizational behavior. He has also published several of his books, including Smart Thinking, Smart Change, Bring Your Brain to Work, and Brain Briefs, co-written with Dr. Bob Duke. And he's also been featured on Dr. Phil and other programs. Beyond the UT campus, he is probably best known as the co-host of KUT's Two Guys on Your Head radio show and podcast, where he and Butler School of Music professor Bob Duke explore the human mind with a unique mix of research, humor, and everyday relevance. Tracy Wooster has a background in interdisciplinary approaches to working with people and solving problems in organizations, and has taught at the University of Texas at Austin since 2012. He has taught in the undergraduate Human Dimensions of Organizations program since 2020, including the introductory class, the capstone course, and a class called Creativity and Innovation in Organizations. He is also involved in two bridging discipline programs at UT, Innovation, Creativity, and Entrepreneurship, and Nonprofits and Social Entrepreneurship. In the fall, he will be teaching a one-day professional development workshop for HDO called Creativity, Failure, and Innovation. His current academic interest is in teaching creativity and collaboration. He is currently working on a book tentatively titled Building Creativity, a Practical Guide. Art and Tracy, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's begin.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, this is great. So what do you think, Tracy? Brainstorming, friend or foe?
It depends on how you define brainstorming. You take brainstorming, what we might call brainstorming classic, foe, but brainstorming, redefine it. It's an amazing tool for creativity if you do it right, and that's I think the trick. How about you?
And so I would say, let's start with a little history on this. So most people don't necessarily realize that the concept of brainstorming somebody had to come up with the word. And it turns out the guy who came up with the word is a guy named Alex Osborne, who wrote a book about business processes back in the 1950s and laid out Osborne's rule of brainstorming, which was, the idea was, hey, we're going to throw out as many ideas as we can, no constraints on it, just get things out there fast and furious, build on other people's ideas, don't worry about how outlandish they are, and the kinds of things that we tend to do to this day without necessarily knowing of the existence of Alex Osborne. But on the faux side of things, very quickly psychologists started doing studies of this and basically asked the question, does it work? If you follow Osborne's rules of brainstorming, do you actually get better ideas? And the answer is resoundingly no. If you use Osborne's rules of brainstorming and you compare groups that are using those rules to equivalent groups of people working alone, what you find is that people come up with fewer ideas and fewer good ideas than they would have come up with had they worked alone. So no, it doesn't work. In fact, there is a term in the psychology literature called productivity loss from brainstorming, suggesting that as you termed it, brainstorming classic is not such a good idea.
Yeah, and I think really what the crux of it is that you have to think about what the rules are, and Osborne's rules are not terribly good. If you look at them, they're not terribly useful for what they're aimed at, right? And
Yeah.
so thinking about defining brainstorming away from kind of that brainstorming classic, that, storming the castle with your mind, where that term comes from, and think about how might you define brainstorming as an activity, right?
Yeah.
So I took a little stab, if that's all right, at a definition, because I'm thinking
Yeah.
about my experience in teaching it. Brainstorming, I think, is a special kind of meeting where one gathers the right people, hopefully, to develop creative ideas. And that developing creative ideas depends on where you're at in the process, right? So I think one of the challenges and one of the problems with brainstorming as it's conceived is that when people think, oh, we need a creative idea, we have a problem, we need a creative idea, let's brainstorm. And that takes the place of a creative process.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas if you look at creativity and study creativity, there's a whole process. You got to define the problem, understand the problem, redefine the problem. You have to do your research. You have to develop ideas. You have to evaluate those ideas. You have to test those ideas. People try to compress all of that into a brainstorm, right?
That's right.
Instead of thinking, where do we need help? Where do we need to keep some good people together to talk about the problem or to develop ideas or to evaluate ideas? And how do
That's
we do that effectively? Right?
Yeah. And I think, there's kind of two components to this, as you point out. One is, how do we get all the right processes in place?
Mhm.
And then the other is, how do we then use the group in the best possible way, which means both have the right people and use them in the right way. So I'm gonna say one thing real quick about using people in the right way, and then maybe we can dig into some of the
Mhm.
components of the creative process.
Mhm.
The thing I want to say about using people in the right way is, one of the aspects of brainstorming that fails us, the traditional brainstorming that fails us, is that creativity requires both what can be called divergent and convergent processes. So divergent means come up with as many different possibilities as we can, and convergent means settle on one or two that we want to focus on. And what we tend to do in brainstorming is get a group of people together and get them to throw out ideas. And the danger in doing that is somebody throws out an idea, and that idea immediately infects the minds of everyone else around them. And then a second person throws out an idea, and now everybody's minds are deeply infected by the first couple of ideas that have come out. And very quickly, everyone in the room is thinking about the problem in more or less the same way, constrained by the things that they've heard already,
Mhm.
which is a demonstration that when you get a group of people together, fairly quickly, they tend to converge on a particular way of thinking about something, which means that when you get a group together, that's really great for the convergent phases of problem solving. But
Mhm.
when you're trying to be divergent, getting a group of people together to throw ideas around is working at cross purposes to that divergence. And actually, individuals, when they work alone, tend to do a little bit better at those divergent pieces. So one of the places where brainstorming fails us is that we're asking groups to do a thing that individuals do better alone. And what
Mhm.
we need to do is to better manage when we're having people work alone, and because we want divergence in the way we're thinking about things. And when do we want to have people working together because we want convergence?
Yeah, and I think one thing I've learned from teaching creativity and teaching brainstorming is how much students and people learning about this really love the idea of what psychologists would call nominal brainstorming, but brainstorming by yourself.
Yeah,
And having, that's one of the key takeaways that I always get is if you're going to come up with ideas, you're going to develop ideas, you're going to do brainstorming, you have to do it by yourself first. So
yeah,
that means, if you have a brainstorming task, you want to come up with a solution, you have to give people homework. You have to say, well in advance, or it's best to say, I think, well in advance, here's the problem. Think about it, right? Give them that chance. And then to say, have written down 5 ideas, your five
yeah,
or 10 ideas, or how many ideas, and we're going to share those because that that topic fixation that you talked about, like the first thing someone says, you can't avoid it. Like
Yeah.
once that train of thought goes, if you don't have other things written down or prepared, people aren't going to do them, right? And I think
Right.
writing down also helps with some other tricky things that happen, some other problems of social inhibition where you're afraid, you don't want to put your ideas out there because you think they're dumb, or you're afraid of what your boss is going to say, or social loafing where you're like, well, so and so is just going to say, give a bunch of ideas and we're just going to follow, the person who talks the most, right? So some people really need that time. I need that time. I can't go into a brainstorming session and just come up with a bunch of ideas. I need some time to think. That's
Yeah.
how my brain works.
And to capture something you're saying there too, the fact that you need more time is uncorrelated with whether you're going to have a good idea or a bad idea. Because what we know from lots of studies of creativity is that when you have the best ideas, it's when you're having the most ideas, because it's hard to know in advance whether the particular idea that comes out is going to be a good one or not. And so we don't want to favor one set of people over another in the generation of ideas, because we don't know where that great idea or where the root of that great idea is going to come from. So we do want to make sure that everyone's engaged. And so even if you need a little bit more time and you're not going to just jump, throw stuff in off the cuff, we don't want you to suffer from that. We want your contribution to be significant there. So I just wanted to capture that piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, one of the key goals of brainstorming is to have as many ideas, good and bad,
Yeah.
to have as many ideas out there. And so giving people time to think. Some of us are deliberate thinkers, some people are fast thinkers. Giving people time to think, to develop, and then requiring, like, having some, we're gonna, bring 10 ideas, and making sure everyone throws in their ideas
Yeah.
is really important, and you're going to get so many more ideas that way,
Yeah.
and so much more thought on what's going on.
So I want to back up in this process a little bit and think a little bit about just defining the problem,
Mhm.
because I think I've often argued when trying to facilitate a group idea generation setting that probably half the time needs to be spent just defining what the problem is. I think people want to immediately leap to generating solutions. That feels like
Right.
the fun part. But actually, if you don't define the problem properly, you are going to get off on the wrong foot. You may end up solving the wrong problem. And I
Mhm.
think there's several components to it. One is that sometimes the groups don't agree on what the problem really is. I once was doing some work for a big consumer products company, and we got a bunch of people around the room who all said at the very beginning, yeah, we want to revolutionize tooth care. I was like, that's awesome. What does that mean? And
Mhm.
when they finally dug into that, it turned out that there were 7 different definitions of what revolutionizing tooth care was. And so it really took a long time for people to agree on what are we trying to accomplish. So I think getting to the level of people agreeing on that is important. And I think the other thing is, from a psychology standpoint, the statement of the problem is the thing that reaches into your brain and
Mhm.
pulls out information. And so your definition of the problem is what's called a retrieval cue. It's going to be the thing that gets you to decide what kinds of information are most likely to be relevant. How you define the problem then influences what people are going to think of. So it's worth spending time thinking about the variety of different definitions you might give to that, in the
Mhm.
hope of building as many different bridges to other aspects of your memory as possible.
Yeah, and I think one of the best brainstorming techniques that I've discovered or worked on with students is what I've come to call just problem brainstorming, is getting my students together, getting a group of people together and just brainstorming what the problem is. Just, I don't call it brainstorming necessarily, but it fits that brainstorming definition, right? So being able to define the problem, redefine the problem, get that retrieval is key. And so teaching, or working on that for yourself with your organizations is key. That's one thing I
Yeah.
know, that's your area, Art, but because
Yeah.
you come and teach that for me. But that's you know, I'd call it, you know, I don't call it brainstorming, but it is, but just to
Yeah.
focus on understanding the problem as a type of brainstorming is
Yeah.
incredibly productive.
You
Um,
know, and one of the places to add to that is um one of Osborne's rules of brainstorming was let's not consider all the constraints on the problem. And actually that turns out to be bad advice.
mm,
We want to actually be aware of the constraints on the problem for several reasons. I mean, for one, because from a practical perspective, you don't want to generate a bunch of ideas that can't possibly be implemented given the real constraints that there are. That might be time constraints, there might
mm,
be budgetary constraints, things like that, environmental constraints.
mm,
But on top of that, there's really great psychology research. So Tom Ward and Steve Smith and Ron Fink have done these really great studies of creativity. And one of the things that they show is that when you don't have any constraints on the problem, then your memory tends to follow what they call the path of least resistance. So
mm,
you think of the most obvious thing you can and you settle on that and you say, that's going to be my solution to the problem. And when you have strong constraints on the problem, what happens is you think of something, the first thing that comes to mind, and you realize that does not satisfy the constraints, and you have to go back to the drawing board. And so, what those
mm.
constraints do is to force you to continue thinking about the problem longer than you think you need to in order to make sure that you come up with something that actually satisfies those constraints. And so, while it's a more difficult process, it does tend to lead to more creative solutions when you do consider those constraints.
Yeah, it's kind of like you know, giving someone a million Legos and saying build something. You
Right.
can be a lot less creative than if you give them a limited number and give them some constraints, right? So
Right.
those constraints are key for creativity. So you know, defining those constraints as this comment says, clearly defining the problem, right,
Yep.
is key for effective brainstorming.
Yeah. So okay, so now we've got the problem defined. How do we figure out who needs to be part of the team?
Yeah, I mean that is a tricky part. I mean, I think, you know, going back to Osborne, you know, the Osborne's guide is to have 10 to 12 people on a panel, one person as a guide and one person as a recorder. That's a lot of people, right? That's a lot. So I think, you know, the research has shown fewer people, you know, the smallest number, you know, you need a few, but a small group you want to avoid. So part of that, what we talked about with social inhibition, right, is feeling like a dumb idea, but you really want to avoid your boss being there, right?
Yeah.
Or if you were the boss, you have to give your employees, you have to trust them to come up with ideas. But if you're there, they're going to be throwing those ideas at you and trying to impress you. And they're not going to be willing to do ideas that are a little bit out there or that are bad. And I want to come back to that in a little while about really the importance of wild ideas, bad ideas. But you know, you
Yeah.
really got to think about who has good expertise, who are you going to feel it's a trick of feeling both comfortable with people so that you're willing to talk, but you can't be too comfortable because studies have also shown that brainstorming teams that have high levels of comedy who really agree with each other uh, are less likely to come up with good ideas. So you need to kind of figure out the right amount of friction and comfort, right?
Yeah, little productive tension is important. The other thing that's really important in those groups is to have at least one person who the profile, I call them expert generalists. They're people who know a lot about a lot. And the most important function that those people play is that they serve as really great translators across different kinds of expertise. So if you're solving a really complex problem, you often need people who have different areas of focus. And those people may not understand each other particularly well, and they may not understand the value that someone else's perspective is bringing to the problem that's being solved. And so when you have somebody who has this very rich and varied knowledge base, what they are able to do is to translate how one person's expertise really fits with another. There was a book that came out a few years ago called Range that made a similar kind of argument that there's real value in people who know a lot about a lot, and it is about making sure that everyone's expertise is respected, because I think in many organizations in particular, there's often a star class of employees, right? It might be the money
Mhm.
people, it might be the technical people, it depends on the nature of the organization. But
Mhm.
whatever that star class of employees is, there's this belief that they're going to have the most relevant knowledge to solve a key problem. And as a
Mhm.
result, we may devalue the expertise of other people who may come up with something that's actually the most brilliant path towards a solution.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Some of the research that I've read talks about the importance of if you really want to develop some good ideas in a group, you have to reward the group, right? You have to, you have to make it so that what comes out of that, the ideas that come out of it are attributed to the group, not that was Tracy's idea. This was my
Yeah,
idea, right? It's not, so that you're creating a collaborative environment rather than a competitive environment. And that's why
right.
if the boss is there, you're trying to get points toward that raise or toward that promotion rather than really build on each other's ideas.
That's right. And the narcissists in the group want to win.
Hmm.
Narcissists are folks who really believe that they are special and want their idea to be the one that gets chosen in the end. And at some point, that competition becomes, not just promoting my idea, but subtly finding ways to throw shade on other people's ideas. And that's
Hmm.
not going to be productive from a brainstorming setting. In fact, it's likely to get a number of people to disengage.
Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of those institutional challenges of figuring out, okay, I've got this problem. I need to develop ideas or I need to evaluate some ideas. Who are going to be the people that are really going to help, work together, right? So it
Yeah.
might not be those star people who might be looking for credit for the idea. It might be those people who know a lot and really have an interest in helping other people develop ideas,
Yeah.
right?
So I'm curious now. There's a lot of settings in which, if you think about the typical corporate setting, where we decide that in order to do good brainstorming, we need beanbag chairs, jelly beans, we got to go off site to some
Hmm.
weird place. Um, what do you think? What do you think? Do we need to be off site, or can we actually get together in our natural habitat and be effective at generating ideas?
I think there's something to, when you study creativity, there's definitely something to environment. So if your normal spot is a windowless conference room with fluorescent lights, people are not going to feel inspired, right? So, having a nice space where people feel comfortable, having some natural light. There's a lot of research. My students found a lot of research this semester because we moved from a windowless classroom and then halfway through to a very brightly lit classroom, and it changed their creativity. So there is something to the environment, right? And there is something to if you were trying to kind of get people to think outside of their ruts, which is one of the key goals of brainstorming, is to kind of not go for the obvious first solution, not stay within their kind of normal track. It might be nice to go to a different environment. I mean, I love walking brainstorming. Go on a walk with a group of 3 or 4 people and talk about ideas. Walking is just a much better way to meet and talk to people.
Yeah.
More enjoyable, better, better for you, helps your brain. Uh, I'm not sure about bean bags, and I'm definitely opposed to jelly beans in any circumstance. But having a nice environment and maybe having, if you're really trying to get people to see this as something, as like a fun activity, right? I like to talk about brainstorming as a game that you're playing rather than a meeting, which, we're gonna
Yeah.
brain. But making it something special is definitely, I think there's something to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, as a psychologist, I would suggest that, there's a big distinction motivationally between approach and avoidance. where approach is there's a beautiful, wonderful, desirable thing in the world I'm trying to achieve versus avoidance. There's some threat or calamity out there and I'm trying to avoid it. And there sometimes the problem you're trying to solve is one that has a threat or calamity that you're trying to avoid. I mean, we did a lot of group idea generation back when we were trying to plan for COVID at UT. So there was a lurking threat in the environment, but still, it's very important to treat that creative process as one that has a little bit of play, a little bit of opportunity to seek a beautiful outcome. Because I think when you're trying to avoid negative outcomes, you tend to limit your scope of information and really narrow down on things that you think are going to be effective right now. And so if you need the widest range of ideas, you want to create an environment that is a little bit more approach oriented. And so while I'm not a huge fan of jelly beans either, I do think being in an environment that feels a little bit more playful creates that sense of approach to it that can be really helpful. I think I agree. Naturalistic surroundings, natural light, activity, movement, all of those create a sense of possibility, a sense of that beautiful, wonderful, desirable outcome that we could achieve. And not every workplace is conducive to that. I think a lot of
Mhm.
workplaces are very executional in nature. A lot of professions involves staving off threat. And
Mhm.
so if that's the work environment in general, you don't necessarily want to bring that to the environment that is designed to lead to a wonderful solution. And of course, the other thing is if you're going to get a group of people together and you're going to need several hours of their time to do it, you don't want people slipping out to other meetings in between.
Mhm.
So getting people away from the office a little bit so that there's no tendency for people to want to duck out can be really valuable.
Mhm. Yeah, so I like to think about brainstorming, like I said, as a game. You're creating a special circumstance, right? We're going to go into this bubble, we're going to have rules. Those rules are not Osborne's rules, but you can establish rules. You have to bring ideas, you have to prepare, you can establish different rules on whether there's critique or not, depending on the group, depending on the goal, right? Um, but having those rules can be really helpful, and then thinking about it as like what kind of approach, right? So one of my favorite approaches, and something that my students in various classes have really loved, is what we could call reverse brainstorming or bad idea brainstorming. You have a problem. What are the go separately, different corners, think of the worst possible ideas, right? And then get together and share those. And what people find with that reverse brainstorming is that bad ideas are actually really great at shaking up our thinking, at helping us see the problem, but it also creates a sense of fun, right? And brainstorming should be fun. So
Yeah.
throwing in some kind of, I do like 5-minute brainstorming games. I don't call them brainstorming, but 5-minute kind of activities. Think of the worst possible ideas. Think about, what happened if we get rid of this constraint? Creating that sense of fun, excuse me, of fun, of play, to make it different than a like informational meeting, to create that sense of like, what if we really come up with something, great,
Yeah.
right? That kind of excitement, because I think
Yeah.
brainstorming, rather than Osborne's metaphor of like storming using our brains to storm the citadel to create ideas, is like, I think about it as when I have a good brainstorming session, my brain is kind of crackling with energy, right? And
Yeah.
seeing the world in a new way, because that's fun, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's important. I think another value of bad ideas is that those bad ideas often help us to to identify barriers that have prevented us from solving a problem in the past.
Mhm.
So, part of what happens when you're framing a problem is you've recognized what the problem is, but you may not realize why it is that it's a problem. And so when you throw out an idea that's just obviously a bad one, when you dig into it, not only is it kind of amusing, but often there's an insight in there that part of what makes it bad is that it doesn't actually address one of the key barriers that's actually standing in the way of a solution. And once you identify that barrier, then actually it reframes the kind of problem you're solving and may then enable you to approach it from a different direction. And so, when you're only focused on how do I come up with the best possible solution, you actually start to edit a little bit in your head
Mhm.
because you're thinking, well, that's not it. But
Yeah.
if I encourage you to just throw out really terrible solutions, you say something that actually contains a real insight that would never have come out had you really been focused on, can I come up with something that's really a home run?
Hmm. Definitely. Um, shall we look at we got a few questions here, shall
Yeah,
we?
there's been some activity in the chat here, which has been
Yeah.
great. A lot of discussion about constraints. I like this. I see there's an issue here about to what degree could bias serve as a constraint.
Mm,
And I mean, I think that's an important point, right? It's absolutely, we all walk into um, any idea generation situation with a variety of biases. One of the first biases is that we know what the problem is. And
mm,
and so, that willingness to actually analyze the assumptions that we're making is really important. And I want to say a word about the word bias for a moment. Bias is actually a good thing, not a bad thing in general in our lives. So for example, if faced with the choice for dessert between ice cream and jello, I am strongly biased towards ice cream. And that's a good bias because I have had very few really peak jello experiences in my life and many more peak ice cream experiences. So I have a bias in that case that is rooted in my experience that is in fact a good thing. And in the workplace, there are many biases that we have to do things in one way rather than another that are, again, good biases to have because, in fact, you're much more likely to be successful doing something in one way rather than in another. Where bias becomes problematic is in those situations in which what drove us to have that bias involves factors that actually aren't relevant to the decision making in the first place. And so I think we have to be willing to unpack the set of assumptions that we're using and asking ourselves, are those assumptions actually helpful here? And often when we need to do group idea generation, it is because we are trying to solve a problem that has resisted good solution before, which means some number of our assumptions probably are getting us in trouble.
mhm. Yeah, I think that really gets to me what is the central part of brainstorming, which is we all have these biases about what's going to work, what's the best way to approach this. And brainstorming helps us to challenge us, right? To ask us why, to see other people's views and to compare them. It gets us out of those ruts, right? That our biases put us in. And again, not always bad ruts, but some of
Yep.
them are, right? So being able to see that, see the problem in new ways by seeing it through other people's biases, right? Everyone's going to have them, is is central to what we're trying to do with brainstorming, right?
Yeah. Um, Another interesting question here is it gets to this idea that Tracy was talking about, having a limited number of people in a brainstorming setting can be actually really valuable. But of course, everyone wants to be a part of it. So what do you do? And I'll say, for example, there's a prominent idea generation technique called 635 that I want to talk about for a second in and then we can kind of get to this question. And the idea behind 635 is you get six people sitting around a table and you give them each three sheets of paper, and what you make them do is each person they have to write a different solution to the problem on each sheet of paper. And after they've done that, after everyone's had a chance to do that, then you pass them to the person to your left or your right, doesn't matter as long as you go in the same direction. And how do you and then you do that, and when you get that new set of papers, you then build on the ideas that are in front of you. And then once everyone's finished building on all the ideas they got, you pass those to your left again. You do that 5 times. So if you have six people, three ideas, and then you pass them 5 times, everyone's had an opportunity to look at every idea once. And then after that, you can discuss them as a group. That technique has been demonstrated to do a really good job of eliciting a lot of good information from people and yielding a lot of really good ideas. But what I want to capture relevant to this part of the conversation is the six. Why six? And the answer is because fewer than six, and you often get an incremental gain from adding another person because adding their expertise and their ability to build on things has a positive impact. And above six, you reach a point of diminishing returns. It doesn't help. Now, one of the things that says is if I have a bunch of people who want to participate in a brainstorming process, rather than bringing them all into the same room, maybe I just create separate groups and let each of them work on it and then take the best ideas that emerge from the teams and do a bake off of those rather than just keep saying yes and allowing more people to come in and then suffering from all the problems that Tracy was pointing out earlier that happen as the group gets larger.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, having multiple groups is really, I think, the answer to Karen's question, right? If you have a lot of people who want to participate, great. Figure out, who might work well together, who has the expertise, put them in 2 groups, put them in 3 groups. I think this question from Lax of how can a team effectively manage and prioritize a large number of ideas without getting overwhelmed or losing focus is a natural part of brainstorming is when you have a lot of ideas, a lot of good ideas, especially if you've given people a chance to brainstorm by themselves, you're going to get to a point where your brain is full, right? And you reach a point of diminishing returns. And part of that is planning brainstorming as part of a creative process where you are thinking about where does this fit? And then let's take a break, whether that's like you're off site, you're eating jelly beans or ice cream or whatever. Take a break. Take a break, have some ice cream, give people some time outside, give people a chance to, your brain needs both that kind of time of focus, but you also need to let your brain relax. You need to put it in that default mode network where you're not churning and churning and churning. Let it, you need that time to kind of to recharge, for your brain to work on it, because that's, usually with brainstorming, you're not going to come up with that aha moment sitting in a room with people. You're going to come out of that room with people with a ton of thoughts, a ton of ideas. You're going to go home, you're going to, do everything and put your kids to bed or whatever. Then you're going to get in the shower and you're going to think, oh, what so and so said, that's a good idea. Or as you're falling asleep, that's, your brain needs that time for breaks, right, as part of the creative process. So, I like to, when I have student teams working, I will give them multiple days of brainstorming on one project and then breaks, right? And they come up with much better ideas if you have kind of a multi-tiered brainstorming process.
Yeah, yeah. And a part of this process too, I mean, if you have a lot of ideas, is to use a kind of what's called a gallery method, where you take each of the ideas, you put them on one of those big post-it notes that you can hang up on the wall, and you just start hanging a lot of those things up so that this way nothing gets lost and you're using the space. I mean, one of the things we forget is that we are visual and spatial creatures. And so, putting things up on the wall, allowing people to walk around and just look at the idea and contemplate it, that can be really helpful. Also, when you're doing this kind of idea generation, I think giving people the opportunity not just to write out their ideas, but also to sketch things can be really helpful. Sometimes because you're actually thinking about a device or a layout that is easier to sketch. Sometimes because you're talking about a process. It's much easier to draw processes out when you make a little diagram than if you have to actually do it as an algorithm written out. And these gallery methods, I think, really promote that as well, because it gives you that opportunity to use the space in a positive way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it's real, the visual aspect of it, having post-it notes, having sketches has been really is really useful and really powerful. Having the ability to kind of add post-its, rearrange post-its, group post-its
Yeah.
is a great method to get people to really kind of have that physical aspect too, not just sitting
Yeah.
and but kind of moving around and being physical with ideas a little bit.
Yeah. And I see here, so Elizabeth has a point about introverts benefiting from alone time. I think actually everyone benefits from alone time. Introverts often benefit from alone time because it's overwhelming to be in a group, but actually for all the reasons that Tracy was mentioning about getting away from a problem, one of the things that happens in the moment is that your brain settles on a particular way of thinking about something, and the things that you're retrieving from your memory are stay prominent, and it's hard to get beyond them. And so when you go for a walk or you take a shower, or you go for a swim or you go for a run, but you change the context, what happens is your memory settles back down, and then that gives you an opportunity to rethink the problem, and that's where some of the other points that people have made or some other ideas that have been percolating in your head may actually come to the surface and change the way you're thinking about things. It's the reason, for example, I do crossword puzzles, and sometimes if you get stuck on a crossword puzzle, you put it down for 20 minutes and then you come back and suddenly you solve a bunch of things that you weren't able to solve before, because other things that have been crowding to the forefront of your mind
Mhm.
recede, and it gives an opportunity for you to get a fresh draw from your memory, and that ends up helping you to solve a problem. So I think it's actually we all benefit from that alone time. The extroverts just don't appreciate how much it's going to help them as much as the introverts do, who feel that sense of relief that they're not surrounded by everybody in the moment.
Yeah. And as Divine has said here, that I get my best brainstorming ideas when I'm right as I get ready to fall asleep in a nap. And I'm a big fan of napping as a create part of my creative process. But napping, going on a walk, talking to yourself. There's lots of ways that when you're brainstorming alone, right? Whether that's before or after a group brainstorming session. But I think thinking about the creative process as a more kind of drawn out process, not just one brainstorming session, but multiple times where you get to, maybe you have one offsite, one to gather ideas, but then you need to check back in,
Yeah,
right? And say, where are we now? How do what ideas have popped to the forefront of your brain? One thing I do with my students is I give them some chance to brainstorm a project, and then they take a break, and they're really hooked. They're so excited about their project. They come back, and I say, okay, now start over. You can't use that idea. Start over.
yeah,
And they're really upset. And they're really like, but we're raring to go. But about a third of the teams will go with a new idea, and almost all of them are like, oh, that was so useful to have to start over, right? So
yeah.
that's where making it a being strategic about how you approach getting people's brains kind of thinking in new ways out of their ruts is so important.
Well, and also, the evaluation process for an idea is influenced both by the specific ways that you might think about the information, but they're also influenced by just your emotions at the time. And the thing about brainstorming is it tends to feel good when you get together with a group and you're throwing ideas around and you're really being creative. It feels good, and consequently the idea that you come up with feels better than it probably is.
Mhm.
um, I mean, I use the analogy sometimes that, this is why people probably shouldn't get married to someone they just met in Vegas during a hot gambling streak, because it's possible that you're taking emotions that came from one place and attributing them to another. And I think similarly, when you feel really good about the process, you may give a halo to the idea. And so anything you can do to slow that evaluation process down. So I really like Tracy's suggestion of just saying, we can't use this idea, come up with another one. But another possibility is give it 24 hours. Like we're not gonna actually marry this idea for another 24 hours. So we actually have to get a cooling off period, look at it again with the fresh light of dawn, and see whether the idea holds up to further scrutiny before deciding that that's the approach to move forward with.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
I want
So,
to add one other thing that hasn't come up, but I think it's really important, which is the very last stage of any kind of major organizational brainstorming process needs to be a plan for what to do moving forward. I think one of the biggest mistakes organizations make is that they get a bunch of people together to brainstorm and they don't then identify a project lead and the resources to move forward. And so, a month later, everyone's sitting around going, so whatever happened with that great idea we came up with? And everyone's looking around going, I thought someone else was going to run with this. And so I think there needs to be a real plan for exactly how this is going to get pushed forward. Who's responsible? Who's our project manager for this? Who are the um, who are who's got the resources, or who do we need to speak to get all the resources we need, and to make sure that that plan is in place, along with a concrete set of dates for people to begin to get together to move the project forward. Because it's uplifting to come up with a good idea, but at some point it becomes demoralizing when you realize we spent all this time working on a thing and then it didn't come to fruition.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's where in that we've talked kind of about the problem definition phase, the developing ideas, evaluating ideas, but in creativity you also have to actually implement it. You have to implement, then you have to test. And there are ways you can think about that people don't necessarily call them brainstorming, but thinking about like, okay, now we have to figure out who does it. We have to figure out how do we have this idea, how can we actually do it, right? So you might get a different group of people together and be like, we have this idea, now let's figure out, this is a big project, how do we get it done, right?
Yeah,
And
which
that's
is which, yeah,
different set of expertise, right?
yeah, and it's far less exciting. Right. I mean, one of the reasons that brainstorming is so exciting to do is because it is blissfully untethered from actually having to demonstrate progress on something. So
Hmm.
at the moment that you're brainstorming, all things seem possible.
Hmm.
And then at some point, a project actually has to move forward, and we have to actually begin to deal with the trade-offs that need to be made and the imperfections. And I think that it's very important when you move forward from a brainstorming session that you set the appropriate expectations about how the project is going to move forward. One of the things that I tell my teams all the time is when we're going to launch some new thing, our aim is to get a B minus when we launch it and then fix it later.
Hmm.
Because I don't want the seeming perfection that emerges from the brainstorming process when you've generated an idea that seems like it's going to be all things to all people.
Hmm.
I don't want that to get I don't want the power of that to get lost as it gets translated into the real world. And so if we recognize that we're not aiming for the gleaming perfection that was in your mind on the day that you came up with the idea, but rather something that actually has an impact on the organization, on the people that we're serving, that's the most important thing. And so, I think it's a matter of having a plan about how to move it forward, and also setting the right kinds of expectations about what success in implementing that idea is going to be. And that it doesn't have to be the perfect solution on day one, as long as it's a better path to be on than the one we were on before.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to think about there is that although it's not usually called brainstorming, testing an idea or testing a product is a type of is kind of fits that definition that I had. So I work with a client who's a board game designer, comes into my class, and he talks about, with a board game, they get a kind of a demo on, made out of cardboard and cardstock. And then their most important part is to have, they set very specific rules, and they have, they watch people play the game. And that's where so many of the real ideas come, right? That's where some of the real gems come, and it is in like getting people to actually interact with your idea. And while I don't know that that would be defined as, it's definitely not traditional brainstorming, but getting people to test your ideas is, fits that definition. It's a meeting of people to work on developing your idea. And so I think a broader understanding of brainstorming and where and how you can use it can help you move things along that process, right? From problem to testing to maybe getting it out there, right?
Yeah.
Which is the hard thing. The last part, the actually doing it is the hard part, right?
Yeah. And I think another hard part, just to give a plug for preparation, is knowing a lot. And so, I talked about these expert generalists, and not everyone's necessarily going to be an expert generalist, but I think the more stuff you know, whether it's expanding the depth of your expertise in a particular area or broadening the base of things you know about, the more you know, the more effective you're going to be as a creative problem solver. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is to constantly be preparing ourselves for the next time that we might be in a situation in which we have to generate an idea, which means being willing to continue to learn things, whether we know exactly why we're learning it at that moment or not. And I think that by the time you get into a group idea generation setting, that's you've got all the knowledge that you're going to have in the people in the room.
Mhm,
So the best time to prepare to have more knowledge in your head is before you go into a brainstorming situation.
mhm,
And that means, keeping a book by your bed, listening to a good podcast or an audio book, in watching documentary movies, but in, exposing yourself to lots of interesting information that might be the root of another cool idea.
yeah. And I think the other part to preparing for better brainstorming is just to practice. Brainstorming is a skill like teamwork, like communication, like collaboration, all these things. It doesn't take a ton of practice. I watch my students go over the course of the semester, go from, you know, leaping at the first idea to really having a process that they can define that helps them to come up with creative ideas and then to get them done. So it's, understanding that process a little bit and learning, right, and practicing is really, really key to getting better, like with any skill, right?
Yeah. So I think just to take a step back from where we've gone today to make sure that people carry
Mhm,
the right messages home, I think
mhm,
that I think I'll throw out a couple of things that I think are big points, and Tracy, you can do the same,
mhm.
but and then maybe some folks can throw out their biggest lessons in the chat. But um, I think number one is being really clear about the variety of elements to the process of generating ideas, from defining the problem to generating ideas to building on those ideas, selecting ideas, developing the plan and the path forward, really making sure that you're systematic about those pieces, engaging in a process where when you are trying to diverge in your ideas, you give people that opportunity to work alone, that when you're trying to converge on things, you give the group a chance to work together, and that you create an atmosphere that really promotes the development of a lot of ideas rather than really constraining the idea, editing those ideas in advance. Those are a couple of big things, but Tracy, I know you have more.
Yeah, I think really, to me, having a clear understanding of your goals, like where you're at in the process, what you hope to accomplish, which will help you to pick the right problem, to pick the right people, to pick the right environment for that, and then to really think about it as brainstorming as a game, right? It should be fun, but you need to have rules. As with, games are all about rules, having the right number of people, the right settings, the right goals, and then really practicing and having fun with that. Like, brainstorming for some people, they hear brainstorming, they're like, oh, I gotta, but to have fun with it, which might mean not calling it brainstorming, but to call it, idea generation or to just do it, right? But to have fun and practice those skills, and keep learning about them and getting better at it, and helping your teams get better at it. Um, you that transformation can happen fairly quick if you frame it the right way.
Yeah. So I think we've probably we've gotten to the end of this, but Amanda, what do you got for us?
You guys made it through all of the questions. This has been a great discussion. I am going to put in chat here the link to learn more about HDO professional trainings, because if you have been inspired by this conversation like I have, you may want to learn more about this or a variety of other topics that HDO can provide support in. As I mentioned, Tracy has a fall class coming up on September 18th. And so please feel free to visit that website to learn more about the professional training courses. But the HDO program also has a master's program as well. And so if you would like to explore the options for taking a really deep dive into the topics related to HDO, you can visit this website for more information. Art and Tracy, thank you so much. This has just been a fabulous conversation this morning. Our chat was very active the entire time. Everybody seems to have gained a lot out of it. And I'd just like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. The questions were great, and I love to see the brainstorming in the chat about the questions. So you're doing it. So
yeah, that was great fun. Good. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate you
Thank you
taking
so
a little
much.
time to hang out with us today.
All righty. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Have a
Bye
good
now.
day.